Hi, thanks for joining me and welcome back to my channel. I was recently having a conversation with somebody about accuracy and how to be a better bag maker. And it got me thinking about all of those things that I've learned over the last numerous years that I have been sewing and making bags. And I thought I'd put together a list of my 10 tips for better bag making, and hopefully you will find some useful little gems within them. And I can guarantee you, number 10, if it isn't something that you're doing, will definitely make things a lot easier and a lot better for you in your bag making. So, reading the pattern. It sounds really obvious, but I'm going to hold my hands up and say it's not something that I've necessarily always done. I have skimmed a pattern. I have thought I've known what a pattern said, but I haven't really. So now what I do when I buy a new pattern is I read the instructions from beginning to end. And I do this before I've even possibly printed out the pattern pieces, before I've even decided on any fabric. I read that pattern from beginning to end. Now a lot of pattern designers will actually usually release a tutorial with their pattern as well, and there's usually links within the pattern itself or within their Facebook groups or their YouTube channel. So I'll quite often watch their video at the same time as reading through the pattern, and I'll make myself some notes. So if I notice something in that video that I think has been particularly helpful, I'll write it down on the pattern at that point that I'll come to that in that pattern. Sort of like a little checklist. I don't actually now start a pattern, and I do have to be very strict with myself because I buy a pattern and I want to get straight to it and I'm all excited and I have to rein myself in, and I make myself read through the pattern first, because the amount of times I haven't read a pattern properly, I've gone ahead with the fabric choice, or I've cut out the way that I'm presuming it needs to be cut out, and then I come to put it together and lo and behold, it just won't work. And I've not only wasted time, I've wasted fabric, I've possibly wasted interfacing, and I've got really frustrated in the meantime. So tip number 1, definitely 100% read through the pattern instructions before you do anything else. Tip number 2 is choose your fabrics wisely. Now, if you're a beginner bag maker, then that can seem like, well, I don't actually know how to choose my fabrics wisely. Obviously, if you're a little bit more experienced, and you've had a little bit of trial and error, then you've probably got a little bit more understanding about how some fabrics work and how some fabrics don't. So once you've read through the pattern and you know how it all goes together, you can then make a little bit better fabric choices with that pattern. If you're a new bag maker, one of the things I would really suggest you do is follow the suggestions that come with that pattern. The designer has put a lot of time into testing that pattern. The pattern testers have put a lot of time into testing that pattern. And the fabric suggestions will have come not only from the designer, but they will have come from the tester pool as well. So if it says not to use really thick, heavy vinyl, don't use really thick, heavy vinyl, and take it from somebody who knows, who doesn't normally tend to do as I'm told, and I tend to go off-piste. It usually does come back and bite me in the bum. So I tend, especially when I'm making a bag for the first time, I'm using a pattern for the first time, I will very much stick to the fabrics that are suggested within the pattern, or because I do have a lot of experience now, I'll choose fabrics that I know are very, very similar in structure to the fabrics that are suggested within that pattern. So, if a quilt and cotton is suggested and it says, don't use vinyl, then that will be for a reason. There probably will have been the original fabric suggestions especially on your first time round with a new pattern. That way you'll get to find how the pattern goes together, you'll get to find how bulky the industrial sewing machine. I can sew through a lot of layers. That doesn't necessarily mean that I should. Quite often using vinyl that is on the thicker or heavier side is very difficult to turn. The seams can be very bulky, they don't always sit right. You know, test fabrics, have a play with fabrics, test what your machine is capable of doing, and choose your fabrics according to that. So tip number 3, we just kind of want to get on and get sewing. And because our finished articles, finished bag itself is going to be washed, so a gym bag, a swim bag, that sort of thing. So this tip will probably save you from ruining pattern pieces in the future, and it is to pre-steam press your fabric. So the fabric that you're going to use, get out your ironing board, or I tend to use my little brick before you even go anywhere near it with interfacing or with a cutting tool. And it needs a really good steam. You know, don't just sort of go over it quickly, give it a really good press, lots of steam, and then let it dry and air out fully before you then move on to your next step. The steaming process and ironing process will bring about any shrinkage within that material if it's going to happen. You're probably sitting there nodding your head at me if you have cut out your pattern piece, ended up being 1 centimetre smaller than your interfacing piece, and that is because the fabric has shrunk but the interfacing hasn't. Steaming your fabric, steam any pattern pieces, and also means that if you don't realise that that pattern piece has shrunk, you're then not constructing the bag and then not having your pieces meet up because they're the wrong size. So hopefully you won't have any wrong size pattern pieces after that little tip. So tip number 4, following on from steaming your fabrics and using your iron, tip number 4 is use your iron. Don't skimp on pressing seams. Again, because bag making can be very, very different to dressmaking, sometimes we can not press our seams fully, you know, when we're using fabrics that are pressable. So, you know, woven fabrics, cottons and such. But pressing out your seams will elevate your bag making to another level, I promise you. So press as you go. I can't stress that enough. It will help to keep your seams right. It will help to stop things like puckering when you're constructing the next stage, because that seam is sitting correctly, and it will just make your bag look so much more professional if it has been pressed as you go, because obviously once that bag is a 3D object, it is then extremely difficult to press. So yeah, don't scrimp on the ironing. Press the pattern stipulates a change in seam allowance for a particular seam. So pay close attention to your seam allowances throughout the pattern. If you have difficulty maintaining the same seam allowance, you know, you have difficulty judging the seam allowance or to sort of know, then draw your seams onto your pattern pieces. No one's going to know, no one's going to see it because it's going to be on the inside of the bag, and it will give you a guide to follow, and it will keep your seams really very accurate all the way around. You can have a machine that you're not really keen on using a seam guide with, then, you know, draw your seam allowances on until you're confident enough in keeping your seam allowances the same. It's all about interfacing. Use good interfacing. We've all been there where we've used inferior quality interfacing, it hasn't stuck. It's all of my exterior pieces. I don't use non-woven interfacing on any sort of construction piece, if that makes sense. Any piece that's going to be really visible and you're going to see I don't use non-woven interfacing on because it does crease quite a bit. So I will always use a good quality woven interfacing. For my linens, I do also tend to use woven interfacing because that is my personal preference. Some people like to use a non-woven interfacing on linens because it is slightly cheaper, and obviously you don't see the linens as much as the exteriors, so you can get away with using a non-woven on your lining pieces, but you will find that you will get creasing with a non-woven interfacing. And for that reason, I will use non-woven interfacing in things like card slots and zipper facings, where I really want there to be a crease, where I want that crease to be held and not go anywhere. That is when I will use non-woven interfacing. So a little extra tip for you, if you're struggling with fusing interfacing at all, I do have a separate video on interfacing, but just because I'm feeling generous, if you're fusing woven interfacing, that needs to be done usually with sort of a cotton setting on your iron. Press for around about 8 to 10 seconds. Some interfacings might need 12 if they're a little bit thicker. And no steam. You do not use steam to fuse woven interfacing. Non-woven interfacing, you want your temperature to be a little bit cooler, so just under the cotton setting. I usually go somewhere between the 2 and 3 dots. And you want to press for around about, again, the 8 to 10 seconds, and you want steam. Always use steam with a non-woven interfacing or a non-woven stabilizer. The two work exactly the same way in terms of fusing. Lots of steam and you will find that they will adhere. Once your pieces have been interfaced and fused with stabilizer, leave them to cool completely before you start constructing your bag. At least 30 minutes, ideally an hour, preferably overnight. What I tend to do is I tend to cut out one day and then make the next, and then that way my pattern pieces have had the chance to cool completely and that interfacing is completely stuck and isn't going anywhere. Tip number 7 is get to know your sewing machine. Each sewing machine is totally different, and even when those sewing machines are exactly the same sewing machine, they can work totally differently. So get to know your sewing machine, test out different fabrics, test out different threads. Some sewing machines don't like certain threads. So if you are struggling with a thread in your sewing machine, try a different brand. If your sewing machine is struggling with a moon thread, then try Gutermann, and vice versa. So yeah, play with your machine, then use them up by, testing your machine for the thicknesses that it can work with. Test your machine for the types of thread